Welcome to Sleep Shaper. I'm Seyful, your host, and I'm so happy you're tuning in tonight. We're going to leave the day behind and settle into a place of warmth and tranquility tonight. I will tell you a bedtime story. A quiet evening in a snowy cabin. We're going to imagine curling up by the fire in a cabin surrounded by snow, the world quiet and serene outside. Before we begin, I invite you to find a comfortable place to settle in, whether you're nestled in bed, lounging in your favorite chair, or curled up with a blanket. Allow your body to relax and sink deeply into the warmth around you. Take a slow, deep breath in, and as you exhale, feel the weight of the day slowly begin to lift. Let your muscles soften, releasing any tension you may have been holding. With each breath, feel your body grow lighter, more at ease. As you breathe in, picture the cool, crisp air of the winter night. Imagine the fresh scent of pine trees and the soft, silent beauty of a snow-covered world outside. As you exhale, let go of any worries, feeling yourself drift deeper into calm and comfort. There is no rush, no need to be anywhere but here, at this moment. Allow yourself to let go, to leave behind the demands of the day. You are safe, you are comfortable, and now is the time to just be. Feel the gentle warmth of the fire, hear the soft crackling of the wood, and imagine the room around you becoming quieter, more peaceful with each passing moment. The wind outside is distant now, the storm beyond the walls unable to disturb the peace within the cabin. The world is still, and here there is only comfort, serenity, and the promise of rest. As you settle in, let the soothing sounds of the fire and the quiet whispers of the wind take you deeper into a state of relaxation. You are about to journey into a peaceful world, one that invites you to rest, to unwind, and to embrace the calming rhythm of the night. Let the quiet embrace, and allow your mind to gently drift as we begin this journey together.
The journey had been long, each mile seeming to stretch into infinity, but Emma could feel the weight of the road behind her start to fade with each step she took towards her refuge. The snow, thick and unrelenting, crunched beneath her boots with every careful stride. The cold air nipped at her cheeks, biting them to a rosy hue, but there was a strange peace in the crispness. It was the kind of silence that filled the senses, where every movement and every breath seemed to echo back at her. As she approached the cabin, nestled deep within the embrace of the snow-drenched forest, the faint warmth of light spilling from the windows seemed like a welcoming embrace. The trees towered around her, their branches heavy with snow, forming a kind of quiet canopy that shielded her from the world beyond. The soft, rhythmic sound of the wind weaving through the forest's boughs was the only companion to her solitude. With a sigh of relief, Emma stepped onto the wooden porch, its surface creaking under her weight, and gently pushed open the door. It groaned softly on its hinges, then swung inward with a soft, reassuring thud, as though it too had been waiting for her return. A welcoming warmth enveloped her immediately, the heat of the fire in the hearth seeping through the cabin's cool, musty air. The rich scent of burning pine wood greeted her, mingling with the freshness of the snow outside. She stood there for a moment, eyes closed, taking in the relief of being inside, away from the chill of the night. and the relentless storm. It felt like stepping into another world, a world of calm, untouched by the chaos she had left behind. Her fingers tingled as she slid her coat off, the thick wool finally shedding its weight. Her boots followed, falling softly to the floor with a quiet thud. The firelight flickered from the hearth, casting long shadows that danced across the walls and ceiling. It felt safe, secure, a perfect refuge. She exhaled slowly, feeling the tension in her body begin to release, melting away like the snow that collected in the corners of the cabin. Emma walked further into the room, her feet pressing into the warm, familiar carpet. Her eyes took in the cozy surroundings, the plush armchair in front of the fire, the shelves of books, the soft, muted colors of the room that felt like they had been chosen to blend with the natural world outside. She felt her shoulders drop, the last of the weight of the journey lifting away as she sank into the armchair, allowing its cushions to cradle her. The fire crackled before her, its warmth spreading through her body, seeping deep into her bones, unwinding the knots of tension that had built up from the road. She reached for the thick woolen blanket folded over the armrest, wrapping it around her legs. The world outside seemed so distant now, so far removed from the quiet haven she had found. The wind howled beyond the cabin's walls, but inside all was still. All was calm. A soft sigh escaped her lips as she closed her eyes, letting the rhythmic crackling of the fire and the gentle hum of the storm outside lull her into a state of perfect serenity. She felt completely at ease here, safe in this quiet sanctuary. Time seemed to slow as she allowed herself to simply be, to let the moments unfold slowly like the flames curling and twisting in the hearth. There was no rush, no pressing concern. Only this perfect, peaceful stillness, cocooned in the warmth of the fire and the solitude of the snow-covered world beyond. The night stretched out before her, inviting and endless. Emma could already feel the weight of her exhaustion slipping away, her mind growing quiet as her senses filled with the soothing embrace of the cabin's cozy atmosphere. As the wind raged against the walls of the cabin, Emma sank further into the plush armchair, the warmth of the fire wrapping around her like a soft embrace. She let out a slow, contented sigh, the kind of sigh that comes only when you finally feel completely at peace. The storm outside felt distant now, as if it were a world away, far removed from the quiet comfort of the cabin. The air inside was warm and inviting, and she relished the soothing crackle of the fire as it whispered softly in the hearth. The soft glow from the flames bathed the room in a golden light, casting gentle shadows on the walls. It felt like time was stretching out in slow, comforting waves. Her gaze drifted to the small bookshelf nestled in the corner near the window. A collection of well-worn volumes lined the shelves, each one looking like it held its own story, its own secrets. Emma's fingers hovered over the spines, tracing their titles, feeling the comforting weight of the familiar, the quiet promise of escape that a book always brought. She plucked one from the shelf, its cover soft under her fingertips. The edges of the book were slightly tattered, the binding well worn from years of being opened, and read. It felt like it had been waiting for her. She opened the book with a gentle rustle of pages, her fingers grazing over the textured paper as she settled back into the chair. The pages smelled faintly of dust and old wood, with a hint of something deeper, something more earthy. It was the kind of scent that made her feel as though she were holding a piece of time itself. The words on the pages were small, delicate, almost intimate in their presence. She ran her fingers along the edge of the pages as she read, savoring the quiet sounds, the soft whisper of paper as it turned, the occasional crackle of the fire punctuating the stillness of the room. But then something else caught her attention. Scent, barely perceptible at first, lingered in the air. It was subtle, elusive, but undeniably present. She paused mid-page, her eyes narrowing slightly. The scent was familiar, a rich, musky cologne, warm and woody, with notes of leather and something floral, perhaps jasmine. She inhaled deeply, trying to place it, but it was fleeting. Just as quickly as it appeared, it seemed to evaporate, leaving only the faintest trace behind. Emma furrowed her brow, her mind racing to find the source. But there was no one else here, she reminded herself. Just her, alone in the cabin. The fire popped suddenly, sending a fresh wave of warmth through the room, drawing her attention back to the hearth. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sounds of the fire and the wind outside settle her mind. The scent lingered, a ghost of something long past. Emma shook her head, attributing it to the isolation, the quiet of the cabin, or perhaps the strange atmosphere the storm had created. She let it go. The book was comforting in its own way, the words pulling her deeper into their world. As she turned the next page, the flickering shadows of the fire stretched across the walls, moving slowly, like the passage of time itself. And yet in the back of her mind, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was out of place. The scent had returned, faint but clear, as if it had followed her into the room. She paused again, eyes drifting toward the doorway, half expecting to see someone standing there, someone from the past, or perhaps from the very pages she had just opened. But the door remained closed, the room unchanged. She shrugged the thought off. There was no one here, just the storm, the fire, and the weight of solitude settling around her. She turned another page, the soft rustling of the paper comforting her like a lullaby. The scent, though, still clung to the air, elusive and strange, but she let it pass over her like the wind outside, just another whisper in the storm. The night continued to deepen, stretching its dark fingers over the landscape outside. The storm raged with a fury that had only grown since Emma's arrival, the wind howling like a restless animal, pressing against the walls of the cabin with an eerie insistence. The snow, relentless in its fall, cast an almost magical glow through the small window, turning the outside world into a silent, frozen ocean of white. The cabin itself, though, felt like a safe haven, its warmth cocooning Emma as she sat by the fire, her book now resting forgotten in her lap. She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing in the sweet, smoky scent of the burning wood, feeling the fire's warmth melt the last of the cold from her body. Her hands still tingled from the journey, but the rest of her felt utterly at peace, relaxed in a way that was both new and familiar. The crackling fire was soothing, its rhythmic pops and hisses like an old friend, a constant companion in the quiet of the cabin. But then there was a shift, a subtle change in the air, an unease that crept in without warning. It was as though the cabin itself had sighed, long and deep, as if settling into a deeper, darker stillness. Emma opened her eyes, blinking, as her gaze swept over the room, instinctively searching for the source of the odd feeling that had settled in her chest. Her eyes darted to the window, the shadows outside now long and stretching, the dark figures of the trees reaching like grasping fingers into the black sky. The wind howled outside, pressing against the walls of the cabin with a mournful wail, but inside there was only a sense of quiet, disturbed. She shifted in the armchair, feeling the plush cushions shift under her, but as she did, there was a faint, sharp creak beneath her feet, coming from somewhere in the room. It was soft at first, almost as if the house itself was settling into its bones. But then it came again, louder, sharper, creak, followed by a hollow thunk. Emma froze. Her pulse quickened, her breath hitching slightly as she held still, straining to listen. The room around her felt suddenly very large, the walls seemingly closing in, the shadows stretching out as if they had a life of their own. She could feel them creeping along the edges of the room, moving just beyond her field of vision, like something watching her, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Her eyes darted nervously over the room, but there was nothing, just the flickering firelight, casting shadows that shifted with each dance of the flames. Nothing. Still the unease in her chest grew, and Emma felt the hairs on the back of her neck rise, a strange prickle of awareness, like she wasn't alone, like something was in the room with her, though she could see no one. The shadows outside the window flickered again, stretching unnaturally, stretching too far. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the images. They seemed to move in the corner of her vision, figures with no form, like phantoms dancing in the periphery. She blinked quickly, trying to focus, but as soon as she did, the figures were gone, only to reappear when she looked away. Is it the storm? She wondered. The wind had been fierce, and the trees outside could cast strange, elongated shadows through the windows. But this felt different. These shadows weren't created by the storm. They seemed to move, shifting on their own accord, not tied to any source of light. A cold shiver ran down her spine. Emma leaned forward slightly, trying to catch a glimpse of something, anything that might explain the strange feeling that had taken root in the room. She glanced around again, her breath now shallow, her fingers curling around the armrests of the chair. But the room was quiet again. The shadows on the walls were still, stretching and shifting only with the slow flicker of the firelight. And yet, in the far corner of her eye, she swore she saw it again, a flicker just beyond the window, a figure moving in the snow, tall and fleeting, a silhouette so faint she could hardly believe her eyes. She gasped, but when she turned her head to look fully, there was nothing there. Only the endless white of the storm outside, snow swirling in the wind like an ocean of mist. Emma blinked, trying to focus her thoughts, trying to bring some clarity to the growing fog in her mind. She was tired. Maybe it was just the isolation, the pressure of being alone in the cabin for the first time. But no, this felt different. The way the air thickened, the way the room seemed to pulse with something unseen, this wasn't just tiredness or the mind playing tricks. The faint creak of the floorboards sounded again, this time from behind her. Slowly, she turned her head, the movement deliberate, each second stretching out like an eternity. But when she looked, there was nothing there. Just the empty space behind her, bathed in the soft, warm glow of the firelight. Her breath trembled as she settled back in the chair, clutching the blanket around her tightly. The fire continued to crackle, the shadows still dancing on the walls, but the unease remained. The wind howled outside, but it was as though the storm had found its way inside, stirring a restless energy that refused to settle. She couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It lingered in the room, in the soft flicker of the fire, in the shadows that stretched just a little too far. And yet there was nothing. Nothing except the storm, the fire, and the whispering silence that seemed to fill the air, thickening with each passing moment. The fire's crackling was now a steady companion in the room, its warm embrace a comforting presence against the unsettling chill that seemed to have settled deeper into Emma's bones. She sat there in the armchair, her legs tucked beneath, the thick woolen blanket, still feeling the pull of the unease that had quietly followed her through the storm. The wind howled outside, and the shadows flickered like restless spirits in the corners of the cabin, stretching and shifting with the dance of the flames. Emma's eyes had strayed again to the bookshelf, her fingers absently tracing the edges of her blanket, her thoughts distant. The book she had been reading now lay discarded in her lap, forgotten in the midst of the mounting tension in the air. She could almost feel the weight of the room pressing in on her, as though it were holding its breath, waiting for something. She shifted in her seat, trying to find a position of comfort, but her gaze wandered again, this time to the low wooden cabinet near the far corner of the room. The drawer stood slightly ajar, as though inviting her to take a closer look. It was a curious thing. Nothing in this cabin seemed to be out of place, yet the drawer seemed off. Almost as if it were waiting for her to notice it, to open it. A feeling of quiet urgency washed over Emma, and without fully knowing why, she rose from her chair. Her footsteps were muffled by the thick carpet, the only sound in the otherwise still room. As she neared the drawer, her hand trembled, though she couldn't place the cause of her hesitation. It was as though something deep within her was whispering for her to proceed with caution, but she couldn't resist. Something inside her wanted, no, needed, to know what lay within. Her fingers brushed the smooth, worn wood of the drawer's edge, and as she slowly pulled it open, a chill washed over her. The air around the drawer was inexplicably colder, a stark contrast to the warmth of the fire. The smell of dust and old wood filled her senses as she peered inside, her breath shallow, her heart thudding against her chest. Nestled among a stack of brittle papers, she saw it, a leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and faded with age. The leather was worn, its surface smooth from years of handling, though it looked as though it had been neglected for a long time. The edges were frayed, the pages yellowed and fragile. Emma hesitated, her fingertips lingering on the cover of the journal, feeling the texture of it beneath her touch. There was something about it that felt significant, like an object tied to the cabin's history. It felt heavy with the passage of time. She swallowed hard, a knot of curiosity tightening in her throat, and carefully pulled it from the drawer. The moment she held the journal, a strange sensation swept over her, like a wave of cold air brushing against her skin. It wasn't just the temperature of the room. It was the feeling that the cabin had shifted, that the walls had subtly changed, as though they too were anticipating what she was about to discover. She settled back into the armchair, the journal now cradled in her lap. The firelight danced off the worn leather cover, casting flickers of light that seemed to animate the edges of the book, making it appear almost alive. Slowly, Emma opened the journal, her fingers brushing over the fragile pages. The smell of old paper, damp wood, and something faintly metallic like the scent of age itself filled the air. Each page was filled with small, precise handwriting, ink that had faded over time but still held its shape. The handwriting was neat, meticulous, and yet there was an unease in the way the words seemed to spill out of the pages, as if the writer had been trying to put down their thoughts as quickly as possible, unable to slow the flood of words. She began to read. The first few pages were simple enough, mundane details about daily life in the cabin. But as she continued, the tone of the writing changed. The entries grew more erratic, filled with vague mentions of unease, strange sensations in the woods, surrounding the cabin, and a growing sense of being watched. The writer spoke of hearing voices carried by the wind, whispers that couldn't be explained, and shadows that didn't belong to the trees or the night. As the entries grew more desperate, the words became increasingly frantic, the ink streaking across the pages like someone had been writing in a hurry, trying to outrun whatever had been following them. Emma's pulse quickened as she turned the pages, feeling a strange connection to the writer. There was something deeply familiar about the way the journal's author described the feeling of being trapped, of being in a place where the air felt too thick, too heavy, as though it were closing in around them. A knot twisted in her stomach, and she paused at the final entry. The writing was uneven now, the letters scrawled hastily across the page, the words almost bleeding into each other. The ink was darker here, thicker, like the writer had used too much pressure, too much force. The last entry was barely legible, but Emma could still make out the chilling words. "Don't look outside after midnight." A cold shiver ran down her spine. She felt it then, the oppressive weight of the words. the warning. Her hands trembled as she closed the journal slowly, the echo of the last sentence reverberating in her mind. The fire crackled softly in the background, the heat of it still present, but Emma felt a new coldness settle in her chest. A sense of unease crept into the room, thicker now, more palpable, like a presence that had always been here, but had only just made itself known. She looked around the cabin, the shadows now growing longer, stretching across the walls as the firelight flickered. The wind outside howled louder, pressing against the windows, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Something was different. The journal's warning hung heavy in the air, its words casting a long shadow of their own, as if something outside the cabin were waiting for her to make the wrong choice. The fire continued to crackle and pop in the hearth, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling that it had somehow grown quieter, as if even the flames were holding their breath. She sat motionless in the armchair, the leather-bound journal still, open in her lap, its pages now closed but heavy with the weight of the words she had just read. The faint scent of ink and aged paper lingered in the air, and for a moment she could almost hear the echoes of the writer's frantic pen strokes, the desperation they had felt bleeding through each line. The room seemed to close in around her. The warmth from the fire still bathed her in a soft glow, but there was a coldness that had settled deep into her bones, one that no amount of heat could erase. The wind howled outside, its mournful cry slipping through the cracks in the windows, but Emma felt like the storm had become a part of the cabin now. The air was thick, as if every whisper from the outside world was pressing in, getting closer. She turned the journal over in her hands, tracing the worn edges of the leather cover with her fingers. The coldness she felt was not from the storm. It was from something deeper, something older, a presence that seemed to have always been with her, waiting for her to discover it. Her mind raced with the words she had read, the warning that had been scrawled hastily at the end. "Don't look outside after midnight." The phrase echoed in her mind, a dull, repetitive hum, like the sound of a clock ticking relentlessly towards some inevitable conclusion. What did it mean? Why had the writer been so insistent? And why did it feel like those words were now somehow meant for her? Emma glanced at the clock on the mantel. The hands of the clock were creeping ever closer to midnight, moving with agonizing slowness, but each second felt as if it was stretching, becoming heavier. Her breath quickened, her pulse racing, though she couldn't explain why. She wasn't sure if it was the storm outside or the growing sense of dread that seemed to pulse through the very walls of the cabin, but she felt like the air itself was about to crack open. As if on cue, a gust of wind howled louder, slamming against the windows with a sharp, sudden force. The room seemed to tremble, the shadows stretching across the walls like fingers reaching toward her. She glanced out the window quickly, her heart racing as she half expected to see something. someone lurking in the storm. But there was only white, endless snow swirling in a chaotic dance under the dark sky. The wind subsided, but the unease remained. Emma leaned forward in her chair, her fingers gripping the edges of the journal, her eyes scanning the pages once more. The more she read, the more she realized how deeply the author had been disturbed by their time in this very cabin. Each entry grew more frantic, more terrified. The writer spoke of hearing voices in the night, whispers carried by the wind, so faint that they could easily be mistaken for the storm itself. But they were more than that. They were voices calling from the woods, voices that seemed to know her name. Emma shivered, the hair on the back of her neck standing on end as she read the words again. The trees, they whisper. I hear them. They're watching. They're waiting. The room felt colder now. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, her gaze darting nervously to the window once more. The fire crackled softly, the low hiss of the flames barely audible against the rising tension. Her thoughts were a swirl of confusion and fear, and the world outside seemed to be closing in around her, pressing down with a weight she couldn't escape. Another line in the journal caught her eye, the ink still fresh despite its age. The author had written, I hear them in the walls, I feel them in the shadows, they won't leave me, not until... The sentence trailed off, unfinished, the last word too scrawled and blurred to make out. A sudden chill washed over Emma as she read those final, unfinished thoughts. The unspoken words seemed to hang in the air, thick and heavy with something unnameable. Something was wrong. Something had been wrong from the very moment she'd stepped foot in this cabin. The wind outside grew fiercer, the storm showing no signs of letting up. Emma sat frozen, her eyes flickering from the window to the journal in her lap, her fingers trembling around the leather cover. She couldn't help it. The need to know more, to understand what had happened to the person who had written these words, was growing inside her. What had driven them to write such frantic warnings? And why did it feel as though their words were tied to her in ways she couldn't fully grasp? But just as she was about to turn another page, something caught
her eye, something strange.
She noticed, for the first time, the faint yellowing outline of something hidden behind the last page of the journal, as though it had been carefully tucked away. Emma hesitated, her fingers lingering on the edge of the last page. The sensation in the room seemed to shift again, the air thickening, pressing in from all sides. Her breath hitched as she reached for the hidden piece of paper, feeling a coldness radiate from it, a coldness that wasn't natural. She slowly pulled it free, the paper brittle beneath her fingers. It was another piece of writing, but this time the words were different, more deliberate, more final. It has seen me. It knows I am here. It knows I am trapped.
Do not... The rest of the sentence was cut off. The ink smeared as though the writer had been interrupted, their final words never to be finished. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she stared at the page, the feeling of dread now so thick she could almost taste it.
The air in the room seemed to grow colder still, the fire flickering weakly in the hearth, casting long shadows that danced across the walls like restless spirits. Someone was watching her. She felt it now, a presence just beyond. The edges of her vision, waiting, lurking in the dark corners of the cabin. And she knew deep down that the storm outside wasn't the only thing trapping her here. Emma's heart drummed in her chest, each beat loud and insistent as she sat frozen in the armchair, her fingers still clutching the brittle piece of paper that had come from the journal. The fire crackled in the hearth, but it felt like a distant sound now, a faint murmur in the background of the growing tension that seemed to fill every inch of the cabin. The words she had just read, unfinished, broken and cryptic, hung in the air like a thick fog clouding her mind. She blinked rapidly, trying to clear the images that swirled behind her eyes, the feeling of being trapped, of being watched, pressed in from all sides. The storm outside was only growing more intense, the wind howling louder now, as if trying to force its way into the warmth of the cabin. The windows rattled lightly, and the dark shapes of the trees outside were bent and swayed by the force of the snowstorm. It was like nature itself was trying to break through, to get inside. But despite the fury of the storm, the cabin was still, too still. It was then that she heard it, soft at first, barely perceptible over the wind, but unmistakable. Tap, tap, tap. A gentle but deliberate knock at the door. Her breath caught in her throat, her pulse leaping in her ears. She froze, her eyes darting toward the door as though it had suddenly become a sentient thing, watching her, waiting. The knock came again, louder this time, as if the door itself were being rapped upon with purposeful force, 3 sharp taps, one after the other. It was a strange sound, unmistakably human, but oddly insistent. The kind of knock that didn't belong to the storm, not to the howl of the wind or the eerie creaks of the cabin's walls. Emma's mouth went dry. She looked toward the door, her body stiff with uncertainty. The wind howled in fury outside, but inside, the room had fallen into an unnatural silence. The fire crackled, but its sound seemed small in comparison to the heavy air that filled the room. The shadows, once peaceful and flickering, had become more alive, stretching and writhing like they were hungry for something. Waiting. Who would be out there? She knew that she was alone. The storm had isolated her, kept her in the cabin, and she had seen no one except the empty trees and the blinding snow beyond the window. Yet the knock, gentle, deliberate, sounded again. Emma stood slowly, her legs heavy with a strange reluctance, as though the air itself was pressing against her. Her breath was shallow, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for the doorknob. The wood felt unnaturally cold beneath her palm, and for a moment she hesitated, an overwhelming sense of foreboding washing over her. The warning in the journal echoed in her mind once more. "Don't look outside after midnight," the words twisted in her mind, making her skin prickle. But still, the knock came again, louder this time, more urgent, and she couldn't ignore
it any longer. With a deep breath, Emma turned the knob. The door creaked open, the sound too loud in the stillness of the cabin, and she peered outside into the violent snowstorm. The wind tore at the fabric of her coat, a biting chill immediately,
enveloping her as she stepped forward. But there was nothing. No one. The snow was a vast, untouched expanse, stretching endlessly into the night. There were no footprints, no sign of anyone having been there at all. The ground was pristine, blanketed by fresh snow that shimmered coldly beneath the pale light from the cabin window. Not a soul in sight. Her breath caught in her throat as the cold air bit at her skin, her eyes searching the white expanse for any trace of movement. She stepped forward cautiously, but the snow stretched out like a barren wasteland, still and silent, undisturbed by any form of life. She scanned the distance, but there was no shadow, no figure standing there, waiting in the storm. Confused and unnerved, Emma stepped back inside, closing the door with a soft thud that seemed to echo in the hollow room. The warmth from the fire, though comforting, now felt distant, as if the room itself was no longer entirely safe. The walls seemed to press in around her as she stood there, breath coming in shallow gasps, her eyes locked on the door she had just closed. What had she just
experienced?
There was no one outside. There had been no one. The snow was untouched. The knock. Had it been real? Or was it some trick of the mind, a sound conjured by the storm? As she stood there, listening to the wind howl and the fire crackle in the distance, she realized that she felt it now, a presence, something beyond the storm, something watching her. It was a feeling she couldn't shake. The knock at the door had been real, but it felt like it had come from somewhere beyond the realm of explanation. A feeling that something was waiting outside, waiting just beyond the veil of the storm. She turned toward the window, her heart racing, and in the darkness she thought she saw something move. A fleeting shape in the snow just beyond her sight. It was gone before she could blink, but the feeling of being watched remained, heavy and palpable in the thickening air. Her mind raced, the chill of the storm pressing against her skin. The knock had been real, but what had caused it? The door had barely clicked shut behind her when the temperature in the room seemed to plummet, the warmth from the fire receding like a tide. Emma stood there, still gripping the doorknob, her heart pounding in her chest, as if it too had somehow been caught in the strange tension of the moment. The wind continued to rage outside, but inside the cold was different, unnatural. It was as if the walls themselves had begun to exhale the chill of the storm, as though the very air had grown heavy with something ominous, something watching. Emma wrapped her arms around her body, trying to stave off the sudden coldness that had settled over her skin, but it was no use. The fire sputtered in the hearth, the flames jumping erratically, casting long, flickering shadows across the walls. The warmth that had once surrounded her now felt like a distant memory, as if it had never existed at all. A shiver ran down her spine as she turned slowly, eyes darting around the cabin. The soft glow of the fire was no longer enough to push back the darkness that seemed to have gathered in the corners of the room. It was as if the cabin, once a sanctuary, had become something else entirely, something cold, hostile, and unfamiliar. She could feel the weight of the silence pressing against her ears, broken only by the occasional pop and crackle from the hearth. Her breath had become visible now, rising in soft clouds before her, a stark contrast to the growing chill. She glanced nervously at the windows, but the snowstorm outside only offered a swirling mass of white, the wind howling through the trees like some great beast caught in the tempest. The window panes trembled under the pressure, but it was the room, the very cabin itself, that felt alive with an unsettling stillness. Emma moved slowly toward the fireplace, the creaking of the floorboards beneath her feet sounding louder than it should have. As she approached, the heat from the flames should have reassured her, but instead the fire seemed to weaken before her eyes. The flames flickered uncertainly, their once vibrant glow now dull and struggling, as if the very fuel for the fire had been depleted. Her eyes widened as the fire spluttered once more, threatening to die altogether. The shadows in the room grew long, stretching across the floor and up the walls, reaching like groping hands. Another gust of wind howled outside, but this time Emma could hear it more clearly, like a low, mournful wail, seeping through the cracks in the walls, curling into the cabin like some invisible force. The temperature in the room seemed to drop further, each breath she took feeling colder than the last. She wrapped her arms tighter around herself, feeling her skin crawl with unease. The scent of the man's cologne, the one that had lingered earlier, was back. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew stronger as the cold deepened. A peculiar mixture of spices, wood, and a subtle floral note that she couldn't place. It crept into her senses, filling the room with an almost suffocating presence. She could feel it creeping around her like an invisible hand, the scent trailing
her every move.
Her fingers trembled as she reached for the kettle on the nearby shelf, needing something, anything, to break the suffocating stillness. But when her hand brushed the metal, it was icy cold. The sudden touch of it shocked her, sending a jolt
of unease straight through her spine. She jerked her hand back, her breath catching in her throat. It shouldn't have been that cold.
It had only been minutes since she'd last felt the warmth of the fire, and yet the temperature had dropped so dramatically that it almost felt like winter had swept into the cabin, bringing the outside storm with it. Her thoughts raced. What's
happening? Why is it so cold? The fire crackled again, but it was weaker now. The faint warmth it offered barely made a dent in the growing chill that had crept into the very walls of the cabin.
Emma's gaze flickered nervously to the windows again, half expecting to see someone standing just beyond the glass, watching. But the snow outside was impenetrable, blanketing everything in its quiet, swirling descent. And then the smell. It was stronger now, unmistakable, and so intense that it almost felt like it was suffocating her. The man's cologne. The air had become thick with it, almost as though it were filling her lungs. She could taste it now, sweet, heady, overpowering. She turned sharply, her eyes scanning the room. The shadows on the walls stretched longer, more distorted now. They seemed to move with the flicker of the fire, but not in a natural way. It was as though they were no longer bound by the shape of the furniture or the cabin itself. No, these shadows had their own life, their own will. She felt them, the way they seemed to shift, to stretch, as if they were aware of her presence, as though they were aware of her every movement. Emma took a step back, her body trembling from the cold and the rising panic. She forced herself to take slow, steady breaths, trying to regain control, but her mind was a whirlwind. She had to figure out what was happening. She couldn't just sit here, trapped in this cabin with no answers. The shadows were moving again, and the air felt heavier, as if it were pressing down on her from all sides. The wind outside began to howl louder, and with it she thought she heard a whisper, a voice, faint, almost lost in the howl of the storm. It wasn't the wind. It was a voice, soft, too soft to understand, but it was unmistakable. Her heart pounded in her chest as she strained to hear. The voice seemed to grow clearer, the words just within reach. But when she tried to focus on them, they vanished, slipping away like smoke. Suddenly the room seemed to constrict. Emma felt the air growing denser, thicker, and the cold wrapped itself around her chest like an iron band, squeezing the breath from her lungs. She could hear her heartbeat now, thudding in her ears as the shadows on the walls grew darker, more insistent. And then a faint tap. Another knock. Not from the door this time. No, this time the sound came from the walls themselves, soft, rhythmic, like the tapping of unseen fingers. She spun around, her breath caught in her throat, but there was nothing there. Just the shadows, shifting, growing, stretching, the coldness, the shadows, the voice. It was all closing in, and Emma knew without a doubt that something was coming. Something was waiting. The cold in the room had settled into Emma's bones, a biting, relentless chill that no amount of firelight could push back. She was numb now, both physically and mentally, as the shadows in the cabin seemed to swell, filling every corner with their strange, malevolent presence. The air was thick, heavy, like it was pressing in on her from all sides, suffocating her. Every breath felt labored, and the temperature seemed to plummet further, despite the fire still flickering weakly in the hearth. Her mind raced, desperately trying to make sense of the mounting unease. The journal, the whispers, the shadows that didn't belong. the inexplicable cold. She had to understand what was happening, what had always been happening. Emma stood in the center of the room, her eyes darting to the windows again, half expecting to see someone standing there. But the storm outside remained unchanged, violent, relentless, a white blur of snow and wind. It was as though the world outside had ceased to exist, everything drowned out by the fury of the elements. The cabin had become a cocoon, a prison of sorts, trapping her in its walls, forcing her to confront the growing dread that had settled into her chest. The journal's final, frantic words echoed in her mind, over and over again. "Don't look outside after midnight."
A warning, but from who? From what? Had the writer seen something in the storm, something in the woods? And why had they written it in such desperation, their words unraveling as if they were being chased by something just beyond their reach?
Had all seemed so real. The journal, the knock at the door, the eerie scent that had filled the cabin. But now, as the minutes stretched on, as the shadows continued to stretch across the walls, she began to wonder, was it all real? Had she been reading someone else's experience, or was she in the midst of her own unraveling? She rubbed her temples, trying to stave off the dizziness that seemed to be pulling her under. There was something, someone here, she was sure of it. A presence that had always been there, lurking just beyond her vision, pressing in on her thoughts. But where had it come from? Was she hearing things, seeing things? Or was there a truth hidden in this cabin that she wasn't ready to face? Emma took another step, her movements slow, tentative, as if she feared the very ground she stood on. The shadows on the walls seemed to whisper to her, the flickering light casting distorted shapes that crept closer, as though they had a will of their own. She could feel them, pressing in on her, waiting for her to see. The room had grown unnaturally quiet. The wind outside now muffled as if the world beyond the cabin had been swallowed by an endless void. There was no sound, no movement, just the deep, suffocating silence. Her chest tightened as the unease in her stomach bloomed into something darker, something that gnawed at her soul, making her feel small and insignificant. The shadows felt
alive, and in the pit of her stomach, she knew the truth was just around the corner, waiting to reveal itself. What if I'm the one who's been watched?
The thought rose in her mind like a cold wave, sweeping over her and freezing her to the core. She had felt it, the eyes that followed her, the lingering gaze that seemed to crawl over her skin, the oppressive weight of something just out of sight. But could it be that she was the one who had been trapped here all along? That the journal she had read, the warnings, the mysterious presence, it had all been meant for her? The realization was like a slap in the face. The author of the journal hadn't been trapped here by something outside. They had been trapped by the cabin itself, by time, by the strange forces that bound the place together, ensnaring anyone who dared to venture inside. The walls of the cabin seemed to pulse with this truth, as though the very wood itself was alive, with memories of past souls who had come, stayed, and never left. Emma's mind raced. She felt as though she was teetering on the edge of a precipice, her thoughts spiraling out of control, tumbling down into a chasm of horror and despair. The shadows closed in tighter now, curling like tendrils, reaching for her, pulling her toward the very heart of the mystery. The coldness, the isolation, it was all part of the same unending cycle. The truth was simple and terrifying. The cabin wasn't just a place. It was a trap, a cycle of endless repetition where time bent and twisted, keeping its inhabitants locked within its walls, forever bound to the place. No one ever left. No one could. Had she been here before? Emma's legs wobbled beneath her as the weight of the realization hit her like a physical blow. Her mind raced, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. The journal had been written by someone just like her, someone who had stayed too long, someone who had tried to leave but was pulled back by the same force that had drawn Emma here. She wasn't the first, and she wouldn't be the last. The cycle was endless, a loop that had trapped so many before, her, each one forgetting the truth, only to rediscover it again and again. She could feel it now. The walls were closing in, the shadows were tightening around her. She was being drawn into it, into the heart of the cycle, where there was no escape. She knew she had been here before. She knew she would be here again. In a flash of understanding, Emma knew what she had to do. The answer was clear now. The only way to stop the cycle, to break free, was to stay still, to stop fighting against the inevitable. The cabin would claim her, as it had claimed all who came before her. There was
no running from it, no leaving.
The storm outside was only the beginning of a much larger, unrelenting storm that would rage forever, trapping her within its fury. She closed her eyes, surrendering to the pull of the cabin. The shadows, the cold, the whispers, they were part of her now, part of the endless, suffocating truth. She would rest in their embrace, lost in the timeless cycle of the cabin, forever. The ticking of the clock on the mantel seemed louder now, the rhythmic ticking of time growing heavier with each passing moment. Emma could feel it. Midnight was approaching, drawing nearer with a slow, inevitable certainty. The shadows in the room stretched across the walls, their forms twisting and lengthening, elongating into grotesque shapes with each flicker of the fire. The wind outside had become a low, keening wail, howling relentlessly as though the storm itself was locked in a constant battle with the walls of the cabin. Emma's breath had grown shallow, her chest tight with a sense of dread she couldn't
escape. The fire, which had once provided a comforting warmth, now felt like an intruder, its crackling sound too loud in the heavy silence of the room.
The shadows seemed to move in time with the flames, creeping across the walls like dark tendrils that reached toward her. She could feel their presence, the cold weight of them pressing in on her, pulling her into the heart of something she couldn't
understand, something she wasn't meant to. The wind outside grew fiercer, battering against the windows with a fierce, wild energy.
The storm had become a living thing, something that could feel her fear, feeding off of it, growing stronger with each passing second. It howled, a mournful cry that seemed to reverberate through the very bones of the cabin, echoing in her mind. Her pulse quickened as the clock on the mantel ticked louder, as though the seconds themselves were stretching, elongating, dragging her closer to an unknowable fate. The air was thick with anticipation, pressing against her lungs, as if the very space inside the cabin were closing in around her. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat matching the rhythm of the ticking clock. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something inevitable, something waiting. The scent, the same cologne she had noticed earlier, was back again, filling the air with its heavy, almost suffocating presence. It was stronger now, thickening the air, crawling into her senses until it was all she could taste. It clung to her skin, pressed into her thoughts, and no matter how she tried to shake it off, it remained. As she glanced toward the window again, she saw it, the reflection of her own face, pale and wide-eyed, staring back at her from the glass. For a moment she couldn't breathe. The storm outside had become a blinding white blur, and yet the reflection of her face in the glass was perfectly clear. It felt wrong. She was alone, but somehow there was something in the glass that
shouldn't be there. A distortion, a shift, a noise, a soft rustle broke through the heavy silence. Emma froze, her heart thumping in her chest. It wasn't the wind this time, it was something else, a whisper, low and indistinct, curling through the room like smoke.
the shadows on the walls seemed to tremble, vibrating with the faintest hum, the walls themselves seeming to groan in response. It was as though the cabin itself was alive, responding to the unseen presence that was creeping closer with each passing second. And then, the voice. It was faint at first, like a soft sigh carried by the wind, but it grew clearer, more distinct. It was a whisper, a voice that seemed to come from the very heart of the storm, a voice that was too close for comfort. Emma strained to hear, leaning forward, her breath shallow in her chest. "Don't look." The words were soft, but they rang through her like a bell, reverberating in her bones. She could barely make out the rest of the sentence, the wind outside intensifying, the room growing colder as she focused harder, trying to catch the words. But there was something in them, something that felt like a warning, a plea, urging her not to move, not to look. But at what? She swallowed hard, her pulse thumping in her ears. The fire crackled loudly now, and the shadows in the corners seemed to grow darker, thicker. The wind howled even more ferociously against the windows, rattling them, shaking the very foundation
of the cabin. But Emma could feel it now. The world outside had shifted. The storm had changed. The very atmosphere had thickened, as though something from beyond the glass was pushing its way in, forcing its way into the room, pulling her attention.
Toward the window, her eyes locked onto the glass, and she felt the pull, the strange magnetic force that beckoned her, urging her to look outside after midnight. The clock struck. The sound was a sharp, resounding chime that split the air, a deafening reminder of the moment. Emma felt her body freeze, her heart skipped a beat, and the world seemed to slow, stretching and elongating, as though time itself had taken a breath and held it in the dark space between her thoughts. The window, the storm outside, it had become clearer, sharper. The wind howled louder, a frantic, urgent cry that rattled the cabin. Emma didn't know why, but she moved toward it, her feet carrying her, before her mind could catch up. Her body was already moving as if it had a mind of its own, an invisible force pushing her forward. Her hand reached out for the window pane, cold and smooth under her fingertips. She could feel the vibration of the storm through the glass, the tremors of something that didn't belong. The outside world was a blur of white, of snow and wind, of howling chaos. And then, through the blur, she saw it. A figure. Tall, distant, and standing just at the edge of the snow, barely visible through the driving storm. A silhouette, black against the white, unmoving, as though it had been waiting for her to look. The figure was tall and indistinct, its features lost in the storm. But there was something deeply unsettling about it, something that made her breath catch in her throat. It was waiting for her. Her breath faltered, her hand pressed flat against the cold window pane, and in that moment she knew. She had seen it. She had done the one thing she had been warned not to do, and now she had looked. The storm outside raged with unrelenting fury, but inside the cabin time seemed to stand still. The room was suffocating, the shadows growing longer, twisting like dark vines across the walls, creeping closer, pressing in from every corner. Emma stood frozen, her hand still on the cold glass of the window, her heart thudding wildly in her chest. The figure outside, the one she had seen, standing motionless in the blizzard, was etched in her mind, its tall, shadowy form burned into her thoughts. It hadn't moved, it hadn't come closer. It had just waited for her to look. But now, as she stood there, staring into the blinding whiteness of the storm, she realized something she hadn't fully understood before. The figure wasn't waiting for her to see it.
No. It was waiting for her to look away. The air inside the cabin had thickened, dense with an unnatural weight, as if the walls themselves were closing in. The fire crackled faintly in the hearth, its warmth no longer a comfort, merely a flicker.
In the corner of the room against the coldness that had settled deep into her bones, The shadows had become all-encompassing, stretching with every movement, every shift of her breath. But then, the moment the clock struck again, a single, resonating chime, a sudden, jarring realization hit her like a cold wave. The figure wasn't the only thing waiting outside. There was something far deeper, far darker at play here, something tied to the very heart of the cabin. She had been trapped by time, trapped by the cabin itself, just as those before her had been. Her heart began to race as the truth washed over her in a crushing wave. She had been here before. The idea fluttered in her mind, too fragile at first to understand, but it hit her with such certainty that it left no room for doubt. She had been in this cabin. She had been in this exact moment, at this precise time, trapped in the same cycle, the same fear, the same darkness. The firelight flickered again, and in the dim glow she saw it clearly now. She had read the journal's pages, felt the presence of the author, and experienced the unease of their words. But it wasn't just their story she had uncovered, it was her own. The author's frantic handwriting, the warnings, the rising terror that had gripped them, they were not written for someone else. They were written for her. The truth was, she wasn't simply a visitor in the cabin, she was part of it. A part
of an endless, suffocating cycle that twisted and turned, feeding on the same fears, repeating the same moments over and over again.
The cabin was more than just a structure. It was a trap for souls lost to time, drawn into its grasp and made to relive the same endless horrors. Emma felt the pull now, the slow, inevitable tug at the edges of her consciousness. She could feel it in her bones, this unyielding knowledge that no matter how hard she tried to leave, she would always be pulled back into this loop, this eternal night. Her thoughts fragmented as she tried to fight it, but the more she fought, the more the cabin's influence wrapped around her, tightening with every passing moment. The shadows on the walls seemed to breathe now, deep, slow exhalations that seemed to match the thumping rhythm of her heart. They stretched and shifted like liquid, moving in ways that defied the natural world. The whispers began, low at first, almost imperceptible, like the creaking of old wood, but they grew louder, more insistent, until they filled the room. You're part of it now. You can never leave. Her breath came in shallow gasps as the shadows swirled and gathered around her, their forms becoming more defined, more real, with each passing second. The cold that had once been a distant chill now pressed into her skin like icy fingers, and the very air seemed to hum with the energy of the cabin, alive with some dark force that fed on her fear. The whispering shadows closed in, and Emma knew with a sinking dread that there was no escape. The cabin had already claimed her, just as it had claimed all those who had come before her. She wasn't just trapped by the storm or by the figure in the snow. She was bound to this place by something far deeper, something ancient, something that had been waiting for her. The journal, the warning, the growing sense of dread. It had all led her here, to this moment, to this realization. She had always been here. The walls of the cabin seemed to pulse now, the entire structure vibrating with the weight of 1,000 forgotten souls who had been trapped just like her. The fire sputtered and died, its glow snuffed out as if it too had surrendered to the darkness. The whispers were louder now, overwhelming her thoughts, but through it all, one simple truth echoed through her mind, clear and undeniable. She was the author of the journal. She had written it just as she had lived it, over and over again, and now she would write it again. The cycle would repeat, and she would once again find herself standing at the window, staring out into the storm, watching the figure in the snow, waiting for the clock to strike midnight once more. It would never end.